Hello, my name is Petar Puskarich, and I'm a performance engineer with Bank of America for the last year and a half. And welcome to the Vivit SIG Talks. And today I'm going to be talking about performance engineering personnel mining. We're going to cover what to look for in a performance engineer candidate, where do we actually find the candidates, what questions are helpful to ask during that actual interview, whether it's on premise or via Skype session, remotely or whatnot, and then also what to avoid. Many of these topics directly come from my experiences the last 20 years in the profession, and as well as most recently seeing a few of the topics that I'll mention at the end of the SIG talk concerning what to avoid in this process. All right, so to start off with here, we're going to take a look at, what are we looking for in a candidate? I'm going to start off with, hey, we're looking for a good mix of soft skills and technical skills. The soft skills are your typical ones where you're looking for someone who can communicate well. Will they get along with your team, demeanor-wise? More of those intangible kind of qualities when you're looking for building your engineering teams. But you're also looking for those hard technical skills. Do they know what they know? Can they actually do something? That was a big topic that has come up with several major engineering firms that I've interviewed with over the past year and a half or so. Where it's not about that the topics, it's have you done them? Can you actually perform the tasks? Have you actually had seat time with the different technical commands? And have you actually performed the actions they're looking for? And I think that's a pretty standard requirement. The big one that I've been talking about for a long time is you're looking for an engineer that can think like an engineer. And what does that exactly mean? Well, that kind of means more of, expounding upon that combination of soft and technical skills of an engineer. Do they ask engineering type questions, looking at details, based off little comments that you've made with them, kind of sparring back and forth in the preliminary processes? When you're asking about different traits of, say, if you're looking at a situation where you're building a scenario, are they concerned about looking at the model itself? Are they looking at the timings around SLAs? Do they even ask about if SLAs are available? Many topics like that. If we're talking about weather, are they looking at the, is it Celsius or Fahrenheit? Are they interested in the trends across different processes, whether it's looking at your particular field or, even talking about the weather, looking at the trend over the last 20, 30 years, what are some of their interests like that? Is it an inquisitive mind? And that's what we're kind of looking for any of these engineers, and especially a performance engineer, where we're trying to hone in on the candidate that has the ability to see those performance trends across many systems, many indicators, many graphs, that kind of thing. We're also looking at the ability to communicate with engineering details, and that's what I've touched upon there a little bit in that first part. It goes along with it. Are they communicating in numbers? Is it important to them that, maybe, yes, they said, oh yeah, I am 12 minutes early for the interview. That's usually an indicator there. When they're answering questions, especially about topics of, say, events that they've happened to perform at other companies, are they giving details such as we have 53 virtual users, but we only know that 7 of them were active at any given point in time across 6 front-end servers and 4 databases, and we know that connection pools are, say, 100 wide, things like that. Using the numbers to indicate that they're thinking in those along the lines of the details involved with what you're actually looking for. I also look for, are they asking questions related to these interview topics that we're already focusing on? So in a couple interviews we've given, the candidate basically came back and said, well, this particular question you're asking is great, but are you really asking this? And was like, okay, great. At least you're pushing back on us, and you're trying to fully understand the direction of where we're going with the questioning. And that is a very good sign for me when I'm giving one of these interviews. Do they come back with, say, oh yeah, I've actually done this particular quest in finding an answer to a performance problem, and oh yeah, instead of with changing a queuing methodology, we changed it by just adding another server in this one position, or we changed a cache methodology on one of the other servers in order to get this other feature to enable. Basically, are they responding and asking those questions that show that they actually know the topics? Another one I look for is the candidate willing to learn the tooling that you're asking about and hiring for? I know there continues to be the whole difference between open source tools, commercial tools. In our case, and we're this particular Vivit group, we're looking at Load Runner, Performance Center, Storm Runner Load, that kind of stuff. So if your shop, in our case, we're looking at Performance Center. Do they have the Performance Center experience? Do they know how to use the virtual user generator commands? Have they actually recorded and played back? And what happens on a playback failure? Asking those questions there, but also trying to figure out, if they are JMeter specific in their skill set, are they willing to learn to use VUGen and Load Runner and Performance Center? It's going to be a tough way to go if that willingness isn't there to at least learn and even suggest say new improvements and features to the processes that you have once they are on board. And finally, the ability to quickly estimate engineering specifics. And this question is more along the lines of the interview questions that we give, where we specifically ask and say, can you come up with an actual load scenario where you have an SLA for a process that takes, say, 2 minutes, and you need to do 6,000 of these particular functions in an hour, and that's really all we give. And there's a lot of unknowns. And can they come up with, say, a 120 user scenario, whatever they come up with certain think times, certain pacing times based off of cycle and iteration times that they baseline? There can be all sorts of answers in there, but can they come up with that on the fly? It's amazing how many candidates that really get stumped on this particular question. And, we're kind of wondering, okay, have they actually looked at performance modeling? What kind of engineering have they actually performed in the previous roles? But, if they come up with, a reasonable answer with some thought behind it, that's very, very good. All right, now that we've talked about, what we're looking for, now we're going to say, where do we actually find these candidates in the wild? And most times, some of the best candidates we found are actually from staff recommendations that are already on board with you. This is very important because usually companies do have bonus programs for finding qualified candidates once they're on, but it's also great that you start bringing in a functioning team atmosphere. Will basically breed that back out. So your current staff will want to have their friends to work with them usually, and normally those friend relationships allow for such that the quality is going to be there too, since the person on your staff doesn't want to bring anyone in that's going to be a detriment to the group as a whole either. So that usually works out pretty well. Other places we've had are looking at, our traditional technical and staffing firms. These are a little more risky because a lot of these will end up being, some of the, you're going to get the cold interviews coming in from those, and generally, the resumes are usually pretty good, but that's what we'll have to ferret out in the next part of this when we start asking them the questions during the interviews. Traditional staffing sites are also out there. One of my favorites is actually Indeed.com. The quality of the resumes out there seem to be very, very high. And I also have had some experience with one of their other affiliated sites. And then Monster, LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a great way to validate your candidates as well as also looking at finding them. LinkedIn gives you the ability to also look around who they're related with in the industry in different fields as well. And then finally, in that, you've got the corporate hiring portals for your own organizations, and that's where all of these particular resumes will basically be funneled into, so you can get them into your normal corporate hiring practice. One of the pieces I've added here is also through contacts made through your own industry conferences and group participation, such as Vivit. Many contacts are made throughout the professional industry groups, such as this, and has helped many people along the way in their careers. It's always great to participate in the different special interest groups or your local chapters, being in contact with like-minded engineers, but also it gets you out into the full industry, and then you can compare and contrast where you are professionally with them, learn new tips and tricks, make new friendships that may carry on to another firm in the future. All right, now for some of the fun interview pieces that we've come up with over the last 2 years or so. We're looking at what questions do you ask an interview in order to basically ferret out who's a good potential candidate for you and your team. So what I like to do is I look at open-ended questions that show that engineering thought process. Anything like I mentioned before, to where you're giving them very vague requirements, which we are all familiar with, and say, hey, come up with how you would suggest a scenario be built out of these particular facts. Many times, individuals will come up with something completely random that we've never even thought of before, and that's kind of fun to go with as well. Questions pertaining to I and not we are extremely important. This was one of the, the tips and tricks of the interview process that I learned in my last transition. We were looking for candidates that are empowered to do their craft and have not hidden behind an entire team, some cases, or organization. We is great, but it just is an indicator of you were part of the team, but we want to know what have you done inside the team. In some cases, if you say we too much, it's very much a detriment to your case. The next piece there would be, as you're going through the interview process, basically look for your candidate to match up with your tooling specific questions that you're asking. And we're looking for, the whole mix for easy questions and hard questions. The easy questions are just there to make sure that they validate that they cover your actual tooling. So is it a virtual user generator question around correlation or parameter direct calls? What about regular expression calls within that? Can they even describe in, say, Performance Center where to go to change a runtime setting for a particular group, that kind of thing? Just to see, can they actually perform the actions that your group is doing on a daily basis? And then finally, this particular question, are there some hard questions? And we ask these really obscure questions, generally from the experience from our top individual contributors, just to see where they stand in the field. Some of my favorite questions arrive around looking at, now it's the Micro Focus diagnostics. It's one of the most underrated but most complicated tools I have worked with over my career. And there are many, many caveats in that system and what you can do with it and how you can screw up systems very quickly. So I'll ask questions on implementation in Java and how you handle classes and methods within the actual instrumentation and see if they've used it or not. If it's on their resume, I definitely ask. And definitely more obscure questions come out of anything listed on their resume that are listed as a hard skill. So if you're looking at C++, you're looking at Java, Visual Basic, looking in the different the tooling around, say, JMeter, or even say databases, the Oracle and SQL Server, that kind of stuff. Going back to what I've mentioned a few times now, looking at performance-related modeling questions as well. And this goes back to that, the open-ended questions from before. Can you display the fact that you can create a performance model from a bunch of different inputs? We usually have about 5 or 6 of those questions throughout the process. One of the next one here is one of my favorites, which is basically asking the candidate for just a brief explanation of how they ended up in performance engineering. Normally, the best candidates actually do have a story, and it's usually involving around some pivot point in their career, whether they switched from development into performance, or they've always liked performance, or they always like solving problems or coming up with answers, to those really hard, bizarre questions, even in other industries. The next piece that you'd want to ask, and when you're looking down through the resume, this is really where it becomes important, where you're basically validating any shared history that shows up across that resume. So in one case, we had one individual say that they actually worked with me at another organization during the same time period that I would have been there. So we kind of asked a few questions to see, gee, were they really there? Unfortunately, I can say that one didn't work out too well because in that particular case, they did not work with me, and I would have known if they did on my same team. So, be careful what you put on your resumes too, because in that performance engineering realm, it is actually a smaller field than, and if you run into someone with a long-term experience in it, they may just know or not know you. We also look for, we're listening to the candidate for those pushback questions. This usually is part of the deal when we're asking them. There's part of the open-ended questions as well, where we'll ask something and they'll look at you kind of stumped and say, now wait a minute, define this parameter that you would like us to use as an input, or what about this particular cycle time? Can I do this? Or some of my favorite are around saying, well, I know the answer to this question, but if you ask it this other way, this is the actual other answer. And those are great because it shows their experience across the topic. I've run across probably 3 individuals that successfully pushed back on some of the questions I was asking, and they were technically correct. It was great. Sometimes actually, you actually learn in the interviews a few things that you never thought you knew. Both within some of the tooling and in the process in general for, say, across even the SDLC. And then finally, look for the candidate actually asking you questions. That's important because you want to have the engagement both ways during the interview, and the questions that the candidate asks you are extremely important because they usually will only ask 2 or 3 questions max, and those are going to be the most important ones to them that they need to have answered. All right, and finally down on this next particular slide is the fun part that's actually kind of sad and what's going on in the industry at the moment. And this is, what are you avoiding in these interviews? And how do you find the personnel that you need? The biggest single thing I've seen so far is basically flat out resume fraud. And with that, I'm basically meaning that the candidate submits a resume and it's either a direct falsehood of someone else's or a copy. I actually have seen a duplication of someone's resume at one point in time, and that one was an interesting one to get through. Other times, it's just the fact that they've listed a bunch of skills on their resume that they have no idea what they even mean when you get them into the actual interview. It basically wastes a lot of your time, definitely wastes their time because they're not going to get the position anyway. The interview questions before are basically designed to actually get through that. Do they actually know what they know, and they're saying that they actually do know? There's one particular type of this fraud that's I've seen now 3 times in the last year alone, which is what I'm calling technical interview fraud. And that can cover, I guess, many different kinds. The first one I'd like to mention would be the one where if you're doing a remote interview and you're doing it through the phone or, say, Skype. If you're using Skype or some other video interview process, it's a little harder. But we've had a few instances now where the person will call in on the conference number and another person will call in on a conference number through them. And they'll basically be sharing the conference call number. And when you ask questions to them, you'll hear the voice of another person actually answering your questions. And then eventually later on, you'll hear the original person that was supposed to actually be doing the interview. On the phone ones, that shows up more often, and then ends up in basically being candidate fraud later whenever you do an in-person interview or you actually hire this person and they have no idea what they're doing when they arrive for you. And that's what I'm calling candidate fraud on the that last bullet point. But when you're doing a Skype interview, the most incredulous one that we've come across was actually during a video interview. What it looked like what was going on was they had the candidate we were interviewing was sitting in front of the camera on the laptop, and they had apparently a mirror set up so the person answering questions could see the screen so they could actually see us. And then they would give answers back to us, so over the audio feed, but the person sitting in front of the camera would basically just be mouthing all the words. It was very disconcerting. And also a telltale sign. Now, one of the things you can do there is basically do the quick finger test. You can basically just hold up to your camera, 2 fingers, 3 fingers, whatever, and then ask the person immediately to say, how many fingers am I holding up? And if there's a strong delay or they actually get it wrong, in one case, they actually got the number wrong, so we actually knew immediately that this was not a valid candidate. And again, it's just a total waste of time for everybody. It's a risk of actually being kicked out of your consultancy if you're coming in through a consultancy to hire firm. It's also a quick way to get that particular hiring company banned from sending individuals for a period of time or forever. I've also seen that happen a few more times. So basically, yeah, if you're going to be a candidate, we're looking for someone who's real, who knows what they know and knows what they do not know, will show up for work for you and be part of the team and participate and help bring the profession forward for you. And that's kind of the goal here. We're trying to find those best candidates overall. And with that, I would like to say thank you and have a great rest of the Vivit SIG talk. Thank you.